what's up, everybody? Steve Schwartz here from LSAT Unplugged, coming to you today to share some analysis around when exactly LSAC will introduce the new style of LSAT logic games on the official LSAT. Before I get into it, please do me a favor, like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It really helps with that YouTube algorithm, and I really do appreciate it. So anyway, on to the analysis. Just for some background for folks who might be new to the channel, new to this topic, LSAC is apparently exploring introducing a new kind of logic games section onto the official LSAT, probably sometime in the next few years, as the result of a lawsuit from a blind test taker, Angelo Bino, who contended that he was at an unfair disadvantage relative to other test takers because he could not benefit from using scratch paper to solve logic games with diagrams in the same way that most other test takers can. LSAC settled the lawsuit and agreed to complete research and development that would enable all test takers to take a version of the LSAT without the current logic games section. They said they would complete this research and development within the next 4 years, and that was back in 2019. So we can expect that by fall, late 2023, they will complete that research and development. We've already seen a couple of initial forays into what that research and development involves. For example, on the June 2022 LSAT, some test takers got a bizarre experimental section containing non-standard questions. Typically on an LSAT experimental section, you'll see questions that look roughly similar to those on the regular LSAT. This is just LSAC testing out new versions of those questions for an upcoming administration. So you might have an experimental section of logical reasoning that looks pretty similar to your typical logical reasoning, or a section of games that looks pretty similar and in fact probably indistinguishable from regular logic games. However, on the June 2022 LSAT, some test takers got questions that were completely different from regular logic games. And LSAC actually said at the outset that they were testing out a new kind of question, that this was in fact the experimental section, when usually they don't even tell you during the exam which one it was. This, of course, threw some test takers for a loop and is quite obviously part of LSAC's research and development into a new kind of logic game section. Earlier this week, LSAC announced that they are conducting a field study online in mid-December, specifically December 16th and December 17th. They are conducting a special research study where any pre-law student can get an early glance at what these new logic games style questions might look like. This is apparently the new logic game section that will come out sometime in the next few years. It will likely be a replacement for the traditional logic games section and would presumably involve less diagramming, where diagramming might not be nearly as useful as it would be on the regular logic games section. Now, earlier today, I saw some speculation from an LSAT tutor on Reddit suggesting that he thought the language on LSAC's website suggested that LSAC was expecting to come out with the new style of logic games on the official LSAT in spring 2024. I actually do not agree with this analysis and think this is a great teachable moment in terms of what close reading looks like. So let's take a look at the language on LSAC's website. This is at lsac.org/LSAC/LSAC-AR-field-study. Of course, I will put the link to this specific page below this video. So LSAC says, if you participate in the field study, you'll receive feedback on your performance on the traditional AR, analytical reasoning, aka logic games questions, including how many you answered correctly, blah, blah, blah. It will be the first time these questions have been disclosed to anyone. Then here's the key language. If you're planning to take the LSAT next spring, this is an excellent opportunity to practice these challenging questions in the authentic LSAT test environment. So again, if you're planning to take the LSAT next spring, this is an excellent opportunity to practice these challenging questions in the authentic LSAT test environment. Now, at issue here, next spring, what does next spring mean? And then what does practicing these challenging questions mean? Now, if we were getting all legalistic about this spring, we're speaking now in November 2022, this spring would be probably spring 2023, and next spring might be spring 2024. That's if this were a contract. This is not a contract. This is just copywritten language on LSAC's website. And the purpose of this page is to entice pre-law students to participate in this study to serve as guinea pigs for LSAC. Of course, you do get benefits out of this. You get to take LSAC questions for free through ProctorU in a proctored realistic environment. LSAC gets the benefit of your feedback on the questions for them to administer these questions for the first time to a new pool of people. They're collecting data, so it's a win-win, but that's the purpose of this page. So we don't need to read this page like it's a contract. This spring versus next spring, for all we know, they mean the same thing. In this case, they probably just mean spring 2023, and I'll tell you why in a moment. Secondly, when they say to practice these challenging questions, what do they mean by these? Do they mean analytical reasoning, aka logic games in general? Do they mean the traditional questions like the logic games as they've been since June 1991? Or do they mean the new style of bizarre logic games questions that have yet to be administered on an official LSAT? If we look at the context of this entire paragraph, they are talking about traditional analytical reasoning questions. Again, at the opening of the paragraph, they say you'll receive feedback on your performance on the traditional questions. Along with feedback to these analytical reasoning questions, you'll receive copies of the questions themselves. It'll be the first time these questions, which previously appeared, have ever been disclosed. So throughout this entire paragraph, they're talking about traditional, standard logic games questions. They are not talking about the alternative, new, bizarre questions that are going to presumably replace the current logic games section. So when they say these challenging questions, my reading of this is suggesting that it's about the regular logic games questions, meaning that when they say, if you're planning to take the LSAT next spring, they are not suggesting that you should study, you should take this, you should participate in this field study now because it's your chance to see the new, never before seen LG that will come out in spring 2023 or spring 2024, depending on how you interpret the phrase next spring. They're talking about the regular old style logic games that we've been seeing for the past 20 plus years. Now, here's the other thing about this spring versus next spring and why I think that they actually mean spring 2023 in this sentence. Later on down the page, they have an FAQ section saying, how soon will I get feedback on my responses to the traditional AR questions, the traditional analytical reasoning questions? They say, as the answer, participants will receive feedback prior to the February 2023 LSAT. So taking all of this together, I think they're saying here that you should do the study in December because you'll get feedback on your responses. You'll get your score. Essentially, you'll get your results prior to February 2023, which will then be useful for you if you're taking the LSAT sometime in the spring. And spring defined broadly might include February. It might, of course, include April as well, or May or June. So that's my reading of this page and why I think that LSAC is not secretly in between the lines suggesting that the new logic game section will come out in spring 2024 or that is their target release date. However, I do actually think that spring 2024 is probably the earliest that we could expect to see the new logic game section on an official LSAT. And here's why. Remember I said earlier, LSAC has 4 years from late 2019 to complete their research and development into the new logic games section, the research that will enable all test takers to take an exam without the current logic games section. They have started that research already. I think the earliest that we know of, at least that I know of, is in June 2022 with the experimental section. Now they have this field study in December. They still have nearly an entire year to complete that research. So assuming they take that entire year, which for a bureaucracy like LSAC, a year is not actually a very long time. They finish their research, let's say, in fall 2023. They then need to actually administer their practice questions as experimental sections on a larger pool of test takers, even larger than those who will participate in this field study in mid-December. But they will also need to test it out on a larger population of thousands of people, just as they always have tested out their other experimental sections. Then they need to write several sections of the new logic games questions because they need to administer the LSAT approximately 10 times a year, and they need multiple test forms for every single administration. So if you're taking the LSAT in, let's say, February 2023, they can't just have one test form for everybody taking the LSAT during that administration because the LSAT is not administered for everyone at the exact same time. It's administered over the course of an entire day and, in fact, multiple days. And they don't want people who take it, let's say, Friday at 9 a.m. to tell people who take it Friday at 5 p.m. what was on it. And they don't want people who take it on Friday to tell people who take it on Saturday what the questions were like. So for any test administration, they need several scored real sections of each of games, reasoning, reading comp. So in order to have enough logic game sections for an entire year of test administrations, they need to have dozens and dozens and dozens of full logic game sections, just as they need to have full sections of several dozen logical reasoning sections, several dozen reading comprehension sections. And it's a lot of work for them to develop all these new official valid test questions. So it's going to take quite some time. So I do think that it's reasonable for us to say that spring 2024 is probably the earliest that we would see the new logic game section. But I don't think that's what LSAC is indicating on this particular page. And in fact, elsewhere on their site, they're pretty open-ended and vague when they're answering the question about exactly how long will it take. They say, I'm just going to pull it up here. Give me one moment. I'm taking the LSAT soon. Will I see a new kind of analytical reasoning question on my test as a result of this study? Their response, LSAC's research effort will continue for some time and no changes are planned for the near future. Now, what does some time mean? What does near future mean? They're being deliberately vague because maybe even they themselves don't know exactly how long it will take, but they do also say that LSAC will provide lengthy advance notice along with free practice questions. So they will give us plenty of notice. What does plenty mean? What does lengthy mean? Probably several months. And they will also release free practice questions. I'm sure they will email everyone with an LSAC account about the changes far in advance to give you plenty of time to prepare accordingly. Now, my recommendation for those of you taking the LSAT in the near future, in my interpretation, that would mean anytime in the next, let's say, 6 months or so, I strongly recommend that you get the LSAT done with before the new logic games section comes out, because you have nearly 400 official LSAT logic games you can practice on. More practice material than anyone else ever in LSAT history. That's plenty to study from, plenty to allow you to perfect your performance on LSAT logic games, plenty of brand new material you probably have never even seen before. In contrast, when LSAC comes out with a new logic games section, the replacement for the current one, presumably, they will release some free practice questions, but I don't think they're going to release 400 logic puzzles or stimuli or whatever this new logic game section is going to look like. It might be maybe a dozen or so, maybe 2 dozen, but probably not too much more than that. So I do recommend you get the LSAT out of the way when all the resources out there from test prep companies like mine, from courses like mine. When you have all of that material available to you, do it with the old section that we already know and love and have got plenty of strategies for. Of course, I will develop new techniques, new strategies, new resources for whatever the new logic game section ends up being. But I've spent my entire career developing resources for the LSAT as we know it. I've been doing this since 2005. And so I've built up quite the library. In contrast, let's say the new sample questions come out in winter. Let's say they come out in December 2023 or January 2024. I'll burn the midnight oil putting out new material for you, but I won't be able to catch up with the last 15 plus years of material in just a couple of months. So my recommendation is, again, get the LSAT out of the way now, get it out of the way in the next year or so. If you can, be done with it, apply to law school, move on with your life. Not like me, where I'll still be doing this until I retire. So anyway, folks, that's my recommendation. I hope you found this analysis helpful. If you did, please do me a favor, like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. It really does help, and I really do appreciate it. And of course, I have plenty of material inside the LSAT Unplugged courses covering the current logic game section, logical reasoning, and reading comp. And I will come out with new material on the new LSAT logic games whenever the sample questions from LSAC become available. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for taking the time. And if you need anything, please feel free to reach out. I'm here for you. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.